Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Christ City. My name is Justin. I'm one of the pastors here. And I want to start by following up on last week's message. It's okay if you weren't here, you didn't listen to it. It's fine. We're going to talk about it a little bit right now. It was on the spiritual practice of play. And so I would love to hear some ways that you engaged in play this week. I will start. On Friday, I played pickleball for a couple hours. It was my second time ever. And it was open play, which is a little intimidating. It's a little cutthroat, but it was fine. I survived. And then earlier in the week, I made paper helicopters with my kids. I don't know if anybody else has made paper helicopters. They look like this. It's really simple. Then you drop them, and they spin all the way down. The effect is muted by the fact that I can only reach like 6 feet high. But I learned this in elementary school in Hong Kong. We would run up to the 6th floor of our building. We would drop them all the way down. It was so fun then. It was so fun to share with my kids. This week, we only had 2 floors to play with. And if you want to know more, I will have this with me at the end of the service. You're welcome. How about you? What did play look like for you this week? Anybody? Splash Park.
Frog hunting.
Frog hunting. Anybody else? Nobody? Dance class. Swimming. Legos. Cheese sticks? Yes. Cheese steaks. Thank you. Okay. That cheese steaks made more sense than cheese sticks, although I'm sure you could play with cheese sticks too. Anyone else? Toddler chaos. That's real. So all summer, we've been walking through this series called The Way of Life, practices that shape us. And we've been exploring over these weeks different spiritual practices that Christians have kept for centuries as avenues to connection with God, with one another, with the world, and with our own souls. And we've done this to remind ourselves that no matter what turmoil or turbulence or terror is happening around us, we have agency. We have the ability to engage in many different ways with God and what God is doing. And we are 2/3 of the way down that road. We've looked at prayer and scripture, solitude and silence, feasting and fasting, and this month, hospitality, testimony, and play. And as a reminder, we have both these physical practice cards that you can pick up at the connection table right outside these doors, as well as images that you can use on your phones at christcitydc.org/practices. And if you come back in September, when we wrap up this series with all 12 of these practice cards, you win a prize. And that prize is my everlasting gratitude that my work was not in vain. Now, none of these practices, none of them fit neatly into one movement. All right? Prayer, it draws us into God, but it also holds us in community when we pray together. It also sends us out because it's in the power of prayer that we are sent out. Hospitality, as we learned a few weeks ago, it reaches out beyond our church family, beyond our friend groups. Pastor Andrea reminded us that the Greek word for hospitality, it means the welcome of the stranger. And the same is true today as we close out this Held Together movement and we look at the practice of grief and celebration. Grief and celebration. I was raised to believe my feelings didn't matter. As a Christian, they didn't matter in the theological world I grew up in because the thing that mattered most was what God wanted. And as a boy and then a man, they didn't matter in the patriarchal culture that told me you can't let anyone see your vulnerabilities. Boys don't cry. So I came to believe that the spiritual life was disconnected from the emotional one. That maturity meant rising above our feelings until they couldn't affect us. And that's not maturity. It's avoidance. Pastor Pete Scazzaro wrote, "Emotional health and spiritual maturity are inseparable. It is not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature." There are plenty of folks masquerading as spiritually mature while their emotional health is in the tank, and you see it the moment you have to deal with it. Emotional and spiritual health grow up together or they don't grow at all. And we need look no further than Jesus. If spiritual maturity meant floating serenely above our feelings, then Jesus would have been the most detached man to have ever lived. But that is not the Jesus we meet. The Jesus we meet felt deeply. He wept at the grave of his friend Lazarus. He wept over a city that would not come home. He was moved with compassion for the crowds. He fell on his face in a garden with tears and desperate prayers. And this same Jesus was called a glutton and a drunkard because he kept showing up at the parties. The most human being who ever lived was not the least emotional of us. He was the most alive, and that included his feelings. I'm still working that out myself. The other week, I got some health news I'd been expecting. I'm okay. I just have work to do on my cholesterol. I'd known it was likely. I just avoided it for a couple of years because I didn't want to face it, because that's how to deal with problems. When I got the message from my doctor, it kicked me emotionally into an unexpected spiral. My health isn't where I want it to be, and that led to, I'm not the parent I wish I were. I probably had a hard interaction with one of the kids that day, and that spun into, well, I'm not the husband I thought I'd be. I'm not where I thought I would be in a lot of life. And then it just opened up past me altogether to everything I can't fix, to the people I know and people I don't who are still unemployed and underemployed, to people praying through health crises and relational breakdowns, grieving loved ones lost, the breakdown of basic kindness, the normalization of corruption and cruelty, children abused in detention centers across this country, and innocent people disappeared off of our streets. And then it went all the way out to global suffering, to catastrophe and war and genocide. It was a spiral. There was a deep sadness and a grief that threatened to tip into despair. And the first things I wanted to do were eat my feelings, numb out on a screen, and avoid reality generally. I don't think I'm alone in those instincts. Our social media way of moving through the day gives us little hits from morning to night, a bit of dopamine, a spark of outrage, a flash of sorrow, a spasm of laughter, and all for the low, low price of a swipe. And even those who are able to stay off the feeds aren't spared the brokenness or the very human urge to run from pain. I feel this as much as anybody. I know what it is to reach for my phone, or whatever else it is that might help you cope. A drink, a drug, a person or pornography, an experience, an exhilaration. When what I actually need is to sit still with my own heart, with my God, with the people who love me. See, fleeing grief also inhibits my ability to celebrate, because then I feel guilty about celebrating. How can I know joy when there is so much suffering? How can I let myself delight when I'm also carrying grief? These questions roil around inside of me, and yet, as Pastor Matthew reminded us last week, it is exactly joy and delight and even play that sustain us through hard seasons, that keep our spirits hopeful and give us bread for the journey so we keep going without becoming hardened and cynical. Part of why both are hard is wired into us. Studies show that the human brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. The hard things stick, the good things slide off. You know how that works with praise and criticism, right? Now think about how it works with grief and celebration. Real, savored joy will almost simply never just stick to you. It slides off. So you got to hang on to it. Grief has the opposite trouble. We don't want it to stick, and so we run. Francis Weller, in his book on grief called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, reminds us the word grief comes from the Latin gravis, meaning heavy. Same root of the word gravity. Grief has weight. which is why we so often make happiness the goal and mistake it for joy. And remember, we're not just talking about feeling happy or sad. Those come and go on their own. We're talking about a practice, and a practice is something you choose. Our feelings matter, and they tell us true things, but they were never meant to run the show. And maybe grief and celebration seem so big you're not sure what they look like, and so let me give you some handholds. Grief doesn't have to be a funeral. It can be a marriage that ended, a friendship that drifted, a diagnosis, or a kid who moved out, or a job you didn't get, or a body that won't do what it used to do, or a future you were so sure of that never arrived. Celebration doesn't have to be a big event like a wedding or a graduation. It can be a good meal. It can be a belly laugh. It can be a hard thing finished. It can be a reconciliation or a prayer answered, or it can just be an ordinary Tuesday that went right. So the first work is personal. Stop letting the joy slide off. Joy is not made to be a crumb, the poet Mary Oliver reminds us. So hang on to it. Savor it, name it, let it linger. And stop running from the weight of grief. Turn toward it and let it be as heavy as it actually is. Carl Jung said, "Embrace your grief, for there your soul will grow." Embrace your grief, for there your soul will grow. Because that is ultimately what this practice is for. It's how to stop living on the surface of your life and grow your soul down into the depths. One of my favorite Catholic theologians is the comedian Stephen Colbert. A few years ago, he talked with Anderson Cooper about grief. When Colbert was just 10 years old, he lost his father and 2 brothers in a plane crash. One of the most devastating experiences for himself, his mother, and the rest of the family. And here's what he was able to say about it decades later. He said, "It's a gift to exist. And with existence comes suffering. There's no escaping that." He talked about how his deep loss as a child allowed him as an adult to understand that everybody is suffering. And however imperfectly, to acknowledge their suffering and connect with them. I want to be the most human I can be. Colbert's grief didn't shut him down, it opened him up and out toward everyone else who suffers, which is all of us. His grief became the very thing that taught him to love. And that is exactly where the Apostle Paul wants to take us next. In his letter to the church in Rome, Paul wrote, "Be happy with those who are happy, and cry with those who are crying." And I want you to hear that little word sitting right at the center of it. The reason this practice belongs in held together. And that word is with. With. Paul doesn't just say, feel your feelings. He says, feel them with each other. A few lines earlier, right at the top of this passage, Paul wrote, "Let love be authentic. Let love be genuine." And then he describes what love actually does. It hates what is evil and holds to what is good. It loves the other like family. It honors the other above its own self. And on he goes until he arrives just a few verses down at our verse. For Paul, rejoicing with the one who is rejoicing and weeping with the one who is weeping is not a nice add-on to love. It is an example of it. One of the very things that love looks like once it takes on flesh in a community. So to feel with another person is to love them. And love, my friends, love is the meaning of life. God is love, which means love is the very thing that you and I, made in the image of God, were made for. Love is what Jesus asks of us above all else. Love of God and love of neighbor and love even of enemy as we love ourselves. That great commandment lays its claim on the whole of you, on your heart, and your soul, and your mind and strength, all of it. But here's what I need you to see, that love is not only what God asks of us, love is who God is. The God we meet in Scripture is anything but numb, a God who rejoices over you with singing, a God who can be grieved to the very heart, a God who is stirred to holy anger at injustice. Father, Son, and Spirit, this community, this divine community of self-giving love that existed before the world began. And so when we learn to feel with one another, we're not just coping a little better, we are being remade into the likeness of the God who made us. So how do we actually do this? How do we overcome the reality that we don't always feel the same things at the same time? Because, well, frankly, we're different people. The thing I want you to hear is that Paul's words are not an instruction about your emotions. They are an exhortation about your presence. They're not an instruction about your feelings. They are an exhortation about your presence. Rejoice with, weep with. He's not asking you to manufacture a feeling on demand or to fake your way into someone else's. He's asking you to show up and to stand inside their reality. So don't wait until you feel it. Just show up. Ask. Listen. Get close. And more often than not, the feeling will come when you get close enough, because empathy runs downstream of attention. And on the days it doesn't come, when you're too numb or too envious or too busy or too far out of sync, show up anyway. Show up anyway. And let your body do what your heart can't yet do. Sit down. Bring a meal. Raise a glass. Say the words or say nothing at all. Because love is a practice you choose long before it is a feeling you have. And that's good news. That's good news. Your grief doesn't disqualify you from celebrating with someone. And your joy doesn't disqualify you from grieving with someone. Bring what you have. And more importantly, bring who you are. And know that we will fail. Because we're human. We will fail at weeping with when we try to fix. When we minimize or spiritualize or reach for an at least and an everything happens for a reason, or just avoid the grieving person altogether because we don't know what to say. But as Colbert said, so often as human beings, all we want is someone to acknowledge the reality of our experience and to know that we're being held in someone's thoughts. Because what do we most want to be? Not alone. And the loneliness of grief is extraordinary. And just someone acknowledging that you're going through it is a consolation. Weeping with is never about having the right words. It is about not disappearing. For rejoicing with, I wonder if we fail at this because we're afraid sometimes that someone else's joy will expose our lack. The engagement when you're lonely. The promotion when you're still job hunting. The baby when your own arms are aching and empty. To rejoice with them then is an act of the will. It means going to the party you'd rather skip, naming their joy out loud, letting your gratitude crowd out any resentment. You will still feel the ache. But show up anyway. Trust that God sees you, and trust that the ones you show up for will show up for you. Sometimes, often, it happens all at once. The joy and the grief are together in the same moment in you. Sometimes they're in the same room in the same hour. In the scene from the book of Ezra that we read earlier, the people of Israel had finally come home from decades in exile. They just laid the foundation of a new temple, a new house for God after everything they had lost. And when that foundation went down, the sound that went up was extraordinary. The younger people who had never seen the old temple, they shouted for joy. But the older folks who still remembered the glory of the first temple, they wept out loud. We're not told exactly why. Maybe they were reliving the destruction of the first temple, remembering the devastation. Maybe it was relief because they never thought they would see a return or a restoration. Maybe both. But then we're told no one could distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping because the people rejoiced very loudly. And the sound was heard at a great distance. The young were celebrating the very thing the old were grieving, it seems. And yet notice that no one's told to stop. There is no announcement that the weepers are killing the mood or that the celebrators are being insensitive. The community simply makes one sound, joy and grief, so woven together that you could not separate the threads, and that noise carried for miles. That, I think, is what honest community sounds like. And that's true of any community that is genuinely alive and on the move. A mentor told me in seminary, when you pastor, you're always leading a caravan. And what he meant was that there are always going to be folks out ahead, already tasting the promised land, impatient with those coming behind, taking their time. And then there are always going to be folks bringing up the rear, moving slower because of ability or disappointment or circumstance, maybe wondering why we left in the first place, grieving everything that was left behind. The ones out front, they aren't necessarily more faithful than the ones at the back. They're just at a different spot. Yet what will tear a caravan and a community apart is when the ones ahead grow impatient with the weeping and the ones behind grow resentful of the singing. And so Paul's instructions to rejoice with and weep with are a practice of holding together, of refusing to dismiss anyone or leave them behind. Nine years ago, this very week, on August 6, 2017, Christ City had its first official service, having transitioned from being a parish of another church to being our own church. Now, unfortunately, how we got there was quite painful and not entirely of our choosing, and so there were some folks here that morning, some of you were here that morning, who were grieving relationships lost and angry at a process that lacked transparency and hurt to not have had a say. And some couldn't even be here because of the pain they were still processing. Others were thrilled. Someone said it was overdue and it was exactly what they had prayed for. Not the process, the outcome. Someone was just grateful to still be a community. Someone else was just excited for the name change. And providentially that week, Minor Elementary had balloons hung around the cafeteria. Pastor Matthew and I knew who was in the room and what was in the room. We knew there was both deep grief and real celebration, and everything in between. We held that even in ourselves. I was still working through my experience of spiritual abuse, processing with a grief counselor how close I had come to leaving ministry altogether. We knew we needed to, on that one Sunday, rejoice with those who were rejoicing and weep with those who were weeping. And so we literally both preached 2 homilies, one leading into the grief and one into the celebration. The next week, we installed our first elders and had a community lunch. The week after, we dedicated a baby, Eliana. All these things we have been doing ever since. See, that day both was and wasn't unique. If you have walked any stretch of this road with us, you know we have sought to be a church centered on Jesus and the fullness of life and liberation He came to bring to all creation. That we have longed to see from the very beginning the flourishing of God's kingdom on display in every life and every sphere of life, on every part of life and every part of every person's life. We have wept together, and we have rejoiced together. Sometimes here on Minor, on the same Sunday, but also in living rooms and at tables and on park benches across the city, because our community does not just hold together here on a Sunday morning. Thanks be to God. In the movie Inside Out, a little girl named Riley learned something it takes most of us a lifetime to learn, that you can feel two things at once. That growing up was never about choosing joy over sorrow, it was about learning to hold them both. That's true for a person, and it's true for us as a people. And so let me leave you with an invitation, and it comes in two parts. The first is for your own heart, and I touched on it earlier. Attend to your grief and your joy. Sit with both. Name both. Don't let sorrow crowd out every reason for gladness, and don't let gladness talk you out of the sorrow you are carrying. One of the practices that began to heal me was embarrassingly simple. My grief counselor suggested it. I just wrote out what had been lost, one item at a time. The dream of serving in the church where I'd found my calling. Friendships that had been shattered. And on it went, filling up pages. And naming those losses, even just to myself. Nobody's seen those pages. Naming them for myself before God was to bring that hurting part of my soul into the healing light of God. And there to be reminded also of all of the goodness that was still mine to celebrate. Don't run from your griefs. Don't downplay your joys. The second part of the invitation, it moves out to the people around you, and that is lean into the withness. Lean into the withness. Feel with each other. And the way in is two questions I want you to ask somebody this week. What are you grieving? And what are you celebrating? Ask it at your dinner table. Ask it in your small groups. Ask it over coffee. And then do the harder, holier thing. Stay for the answer. Weep with the one. Rejoice with the other. I know we're all in different places this morning. Some of you came in with a grief so heavy you can't imagine celebrating anything. And I want you to hear that you don't have to fake it. Let the rest of us carry the joy for you for a while. Some of you came in grateful for good news and wondering whether it's even okay to be this happy while others are hurting. And I want you to hear that your joy is not a betrayal. It's bread for the journey, and we need that too. Some of you have numbed for so long you can't remember the last time you felt either one. And the invitation is just to turn toward one thing, one grief, one joy, and let yourself feel it. And some of you have been carrying everyone else's sorrows for so long, but no one's asked you about yours. And so let me ask, what are you grieving? What are you celebrating? You get to be held too. Because here's what I believe. When a community learns to make that sound, the weeping and the rejoicing so woven together that you can't tell them apart, it isn't a mess to be cleaned up. It isn't a tension to be resolved. It isn't something to be sanitized. It is the sound of a people fully alive, drawn in and held together, and in a moment sent back out by the love of God that is with us. That is the sound I want us to make. And so before we go, I want us to actually practice this. And I'm asking you to trust me and to trust us and to take a small risk. I want you to turn to someone around you and take about 5 minutes, a couple minutes each, and share one thing you're grieving or one thing you're celebrating. Or if you talk fast and don't give details, you could do both. With whatever transparency and vulnerability you can muster this morning. And then pray for one another, or just say a word of blessing if you'd prefer. Then in 5 minutes, I'll draw us back together to come to the table. Now, if you would genuinely prefer not to engage, that is completely fine. Neither God nor we are about coercion. If you would genuinely prefer not to engage, you can say no thank you and reflect on your own, but let me encourage us to give it a go. What are you grieving and what are you celebrating? 5 minutes. Go. Friends, I think this is a little bit of what it looks like when the Spirit shows up through one another and who we can be for one another. And whether you have talked or prayed or spoken with somebody that you knew, somebody that you came with, or a stranger, I hope that you feel a little more seen today. I hope you find more of these spaces. Not just today, not just this week, but in your life. Every week here at Christ City, we take communion together. We come to the table as a way of reminding ourselves that that is the centerpiece of our faith, that Jesus and what Jesus did in demonstrating to us the love of God, and what that looks like is what matters. Jesus, as we remember, was the one who felt most deeply, who wept, who grieved, who laughed, who joked, who celebrated, who partied. And we're told, and the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. For the joy set before him, endured the cross. Grief and joy held together, same place. In the same body, in Jesus' body. And so when we come to the table, we remember that we are drawn in, that we are invited, that we are held together. We take this in community together. And then we're sent out. We're sent out to feel with, to love, to live a better alternative than much of what we see. And so when you are ready, we'll invite you to come down the center aisles. The band is going to come back up. And when you're ready, you can come down the center aisles. We'll put the packet, Andrea and I will put the packet in your hand. Represents the broken body of Jesus and the shed blood of Jesus. If you would like gluten-free, we have that too. You can just ask. And then we have a prayer station over there. We will have counselors over there. Mary Grace will be over there. I'll go over there afterwards. But you all just spent time talking and praying with somebody near you. You can also pray with them. And so when you're ready, we invite you to the table.